The little girl dropped her fork. The sound echoed across the Thanksgiving table like a gunshot. 11 guests froze. Adrian Whitfield, seated at the right hand of the most powerful man in Boston, reached for her wine glass with fingers that had already begun to tremble. Because 5-year-old Lily Calloway had just pushed her plate away, crossed her arms, and said 7 words that would shatter every lie in that mansion. "I'm not eating until my real mommy sits here." Garrett Calloway stared at his daughter. Adrienne's smile cracked at the edges. And then Lily pointed one small finger directly at Rosa Delgado, the woman standing in the kitchen doorway holding a serving tray, and screamed the sentence that turned every face white. "She's my real mommy. You locked me in my room last Tuesday." The fork was still spinning on the marble floor when Garrett reached for his phone. "Before we get into this, one quick question. Where are you watching from right now? Drop your city or country in the comments. I love seeing how far these stories travel across the world. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button. We tell stories like this every single week. The kind that sit in your chest long after the video ends and make you look at the quiet people around you a little differently. And trust me, do not skip ahead on this one. The moment that little girl opens her mouth at that dinner table, everything changes. And what comes after, you will never see it coming. No more waiting. Let's get into it." 6 months earlier, Garrett Calloway had stood in the same dining room staring at an empty high chair. The chair had a smear of dried applesauce on the armrest that no one had cleaned because no one had been hired yet to clean anything. The mansion on Beacon Hill, 4 stories of red brick, walnut banisters, rooms that smelled of old leather and older money, had been slowly falling apart since the morning Elena died. The car accident took 11 seconds. The police report said she lost control on a wet stretch of Route 2 coming back from her sister's house in Concord. Garrett read that report 40 times. 40 times he traced the diagram of the skid marks with his finger, trying to understand how a Tuesday morning errand could end a life that held everything together. Elena had been the one who remembered Lily's pediatrician appointments. Elena had been the one who sang to Lily in the bathtub. Elena had been the one who made the house feel like something more than a structure with expensive furniture inside it. After she was gone, the structure remained. The furniture remained. But the feeling disappeared like steam from a cup no one was drinking. Garrett buried himself in Callaway Maritime Holdings the way drowning men grab driftwood. He left for the harbor office at 6 in the morning and returned after 9 at night. His mother Margaret, a woman with silver hair and a spine made of New England granite, moved into the guest suite to watch Lily. But Margaret was 67. Her knees ached on the stairs. Her patience, once legendary, had started to thin under the weight of grief she refused to name out loud. They needed help. Margaret made the call to the staffing agency on a Thursday. By Friday afternoon, Rosa Delgado walked through the service entrance carrying a small duffel bag and a wooden hairbrush tucked into the side pocket. She did not look up at the chandelier in the foyer. She did not pause at the oil painting of Elena that still hung above the mantelpiece. She asked one question: "Where does the little girl sleep?" and went straight to work. Garrett barely noticed her. He noticed her the way people notice wallpaper, present, functional, invisible. Adrian Whitfield noticed her immediately. Adrian had appeared in Garrett's life 4 months after the funeral, introduced through Douglas Pratt at a maritime industry fundraiser in Back Bay. She was everything the grief-stricken widower thought he needed: organized, elegant, attentive. She remembered his coffee order. She texted him motivational quotes at 6 in the morning. She wore Elena's favorite color, deep navy, to their 3rd date, and Garrett didn't realize it was calculated until much later. By the time Rosa had been in the house for 3 months, Adrian had moved into the master bedroom. By the time Rosa had been there for 6, Adrian had a ring on her finger and a plan behind her smile that no one in that household suspected, except a 5-year-old girl who had stopped talking to everyone but the woman who brushed her hair every night. Rosa's room was in the basement, not the finished kind with carpet and recessed lighting, the kind with exposed pipes overhead and a window the size of a shoebox that let in just enough daylight to tell morning from afternoon. She had a single bed, a dresser she never fully unpacked, and a hook on the back of the door where she hung her apron before climbing under the covers each night. She never complained. Not once. Not when Adrian left wine-stained napkins balled up on the bathroom floor instead of the hamper. Not when the grocery list grew longer every week without a word of thanks. Not when Adrian started calling her the help instead of her name. Right there in front of guests. As though Rosa were a feature of the house rather than a person inside it. Rosa cleaned. She cooked when Helen needed the afternoon off. She ironed shirts Garrett never thanked her for and polished silver Adrian never acknowledged. She moved through that mansion the way weather moves through a city. Constantly present, rarely noticed, silently shaping everything. But every night at 8:15 something changed. Rosa would climb the back staircase to the 3rd floor, knock twice on Lily's bedroom door, 2 soft knocks, always 2, and wait until a small voice said, "Come in." Lily would already be in her pajamas, sitting cross-legged on the bed with her stuffed rabbit pressed against her chest, waiting. Not for a story, not for a glass of water, for the brush. The wooden hairbrush had belonged to Rosa's mother, Carmen. It was small, oval, with a handle worn smooth from decades of use. Carmen Delgado had brushed Rosa's hair with it every night in their apartment in Lawrence, Massachusetts, until the night she didn't come home from her shift at the textile mill. Heart attack on the factory floor. Rosa was 19. She buried her mother on a Tuesday and became the parent of 2 younger siblings by Wednesday morning. That brush was the only thing Rosa kept from her mother's belongings. Everything else was sold or given away to cover the funeral. But the brush stayed. And now, every night in a mansion that wasn't hers, Rosa pulled it through Lily Calloway's tangled blonde hair and hummed the same melody Carmen used to hum. A tune with no name and no words that meant everything. Lily had not spoken for 4 months after Elena's death. For months of silence that terrified Garrett and baffled 3 different child therapists. The first word she said when she finally broke that silence was not "Daddy." It was "again." Whispered to Rosa at 8:17 on a Thursday night because Rosa had stopped humming and Lily wanted the song to continue. Helen saw it all. The old cook stood at the end of the hallway every night, watching through the half-open door, pressing a dish towel against her mouth so the sound of her crying wouldn't interrupt the only tender thing left in that house. The dining room had not moved. 11 guests sat frozen in their chairs like figures in a painting no one had commissioned. The cranberry sauce was getting cold. The turkey steam had stopped rising. And Garrett Calloway, still holding his phone in his right hand, was scrolling through the nanny cam app he had installed 3 months ago when Lily started waking up screaming in the middle of the night. He had installed the cameras for safety. 2 small devices, one in Lily's bedroom, one in the upstairs hallway, synced to an app he checked maybe once a week, sometimes less. He had never seen anything alarming. But he had also never scrolled back to a Tuesday. Last Tuesday. His thumb moved across the screen. The footage loaded. The timestamp read 6:47 p.m. And there it was. Adrian Whitfield standing in Lily's doorway. Lily on the floor in her pajamas, crying, a dark stain of grape juice spreading across the carpet near Adrienne's beige heels. Adrienne's mouth was moving. The camera had audio. Garrett pressed the volume button and held the phone slightly away from his ear. But the room was so silent that every word bled out into the air like smoke. "You disgusting little brat. Do you know how much this dress costs? More than your nanny makes in a month. Get inside. Get inside now. You are not coming out until I say so." The footage showed Adrian grabbing Lily by the wrist. Not gently, not the way you redirect a child, with a sharp downward yank that made the girl stumble. Lily's stuffed rabbit fell from her arms. Adrian kicked it to the side with her heel. Then she stepped out and pulled the door shut. The lock clicked. From inside the room, the sound of a 5-year-old sobbing into carpet fibers came through the phone speaker like something being torn slowly in half. Margaret Calloway set her fork down. Her hand was shaking. Garrett did not look up. He kept scrolling. 7:12 p.m. Lily still crying, now sitting in the corner with her arms around her knees. 7:38 p.m. The crying had stopped. Lily was lying on her side on the floor, asleep, her face swollen and red, the rabbit still where Adrian had kicked it. 8:16 p.m. The door opened again. But it was not Adrian. It was Rosa. Rosa knelt beside the girl. She lifted her from the floor without waking her. She placed her on the bed, tucked the blanket around her shoulders, retrieved the rabbit, and pressed it into Lily's arms. Then she sat on the edge of the mattress and pulled the wooden hairbrush from her apron pocket. She brushed Lily's hair in the dark for 11 minutes. The timestamp proved it. 11 minutes of a woman no one noticed doing the only thing that mattered. Garrett looked up from the phone. His eyes found Adrian across the table. She had not moved, but her face had changed. The color was gone. The performance was over. "How long?" he said. His voice was low, the kind of low that comes right before something irreversible. "How long have you been doing this to my daughter?" But Adrian didn't answer, because the answer wasn't going to come from her. It was going to come from the woman still standing in the kitchen doorway, holding a serving tray, who had been silently protecting his child for over a year. Thanksgiving night ended without dessert. The guests left in silence, retrieving coats from the hallway closet without making eye contact with anyone. Adrian locked herself in the guest bedroom upstairs. Margaret took Lily to her own suite and stayed with her until the girl fell asleep clutching both the rabbit and the old woman's hand. Garrett sat alone in the dining room for 45 minutes staring at a plate of untouched sweet potatoes before he stood up and walked downstairs. He had never been to the basement. In 18 months of Rosa working under his roof, sleeping under his floor, keeping his daughter alive in ways he was only now beginning to understand, Garrett Calloway had never once walked down those stairs. He stood at the bottom step and looked at a room that made his chest physically tighten. A single bed with a blanket so thin he could see the outline of the mattress springs beneath it. A shoebox window. Pipes overhead that dripped condensation onto a towel she had placed on the floor to catch it. On the dresser, 3 things: a photograph of a woman who looked like an older version of Rosa, a bus pass, and the wooden hairbrush. That was it. That was the entire life of the woman who had been holding his world together. He picked up the photograph. On the back, written in pencil that had faded almost to nothing, Carmen Delgado, Lawrence, 1996. He set it down carefully, as though the frame might dissolve if he pressed too hard. The next morning, Garrett drove to Lawrence. Rosa had taken the day off, Margaret insisted, and had gone home. Home was a 3rd-floor walk-up above a laundromat on Essex Street. The hallway smelled like dryer sheets and something fried from 2 floors below. The staircase railing was loose. A fluorescent bulb on the 2nd landing flickered in a rhythm that felt like a headache. Rosa opened the door and the surprise on her face lasted a full 3 seconds before she stepped aside without a word. The apartment was clean. Spotless, actually, but it was small enough that Garrett could see every corner from the doorway. A kitchen table with 2 chairs. A couch with a folded blanket. A bookshelf made of stacked milk crates filled with paperback novels. And sitting at the table, a young man with a surgical scar running from his collarbone to just below his ear, eating cereal and reading a community college textbook. "This is my brother Mateo," Rosa said. "He's studying to be a paramedic." Mateo stood up and shook Garrett's hand. His grip was firm, but his eyes were cautious. The eyes of someone who had learned early that men in expensive coats don't visit apartments like this one without a reason. If this story is keeping you hooked, hit that like button right now. It helps more people find stories that truly matter. Garrett looked at the milk crate bookshelf. He looked at the cereal bowl. He looked at the scar on Mateo's neck that Rosa had paid for by pawning the only pendant she had left of her mother. And something shifted behind his ribs. Not guilt exactly, but something heavier. Something that tasted like shame mixed with a question he couldn't stop asking himself. How did I live 10 feet above this woman for 18 months and never once ask where she came from? But the answer to that question was about to become irrelevant. Because what Garrett didn't know yet, what no one in that house knew yet, was that Adrian had not spent the night crying in the guest bedroom. She had spent it making phone calls. And the person on the other end of every single one of them was Douglas Pratt. Rosa returned to the mansion on Saturday morning. She came in through the service entrance the way she always did, hung her coat on the hook by the basement door, tied her apron, and began wiping down the kitchen counters as though nothing had changed. Helen watched her from across the kitchen without saying a word. The old cook had seen enough in her 20 years with the Callaways to know that the storm had not passed. It had only paused to reload. Adrian came downstairs at 11. Her makeup was flawless. Her hair was pressed into the kind of effortless wave that takes 45 minutes to achieve. She wore a cream cashmere sweater and pearl earrings, and she smiled at Helen as she passed through the kitchen. A smile so bright and so perfectly timed that it could have been rehearsed in front of a mirror. Probably was. She waited until Helen stepped out to the garden to check the herb supply. Then she turned to Rosa. The kitchen door swung shut. The two women stood 5 feet apart. Adrian leaned against the marble island with her arms crossed. Rosa stood near the sink with a sponge in her hand. Still wet, still dripping onto the floor in a rhythm that sounded louder than it should have in the silence between them. "You think you won something on Thursday, don't you?" Rosa didn't answer. She squeezed the sponge once and set it on the counter. "Let me explain how this works," Adrian continued, her voice low, conversational, almost friendly. The tone of a woman who had practiced cruelty the way other people practiced piano. "Garrett feels guilty right now. That's all this is. Guilt. He saw a video, he got emotional. He drove to your sad little apartment and felt sorry for you. That's what men like him do. They feel sorry and then they forget. It's already fading. By Christmas, he won't remember your name." Rosa said nothing. Her hands were still at her sides. Her face had not changed. Adrian stepped closer. Close enough that Rosa could smell the jasmine perfume. The same perfume that lingered in the hallways every morning like an announcement. "I know people, Rosa. People who handle paperwork. People who can make a work permit disappear like it never existed. I know people who can make sure your little brother loses his financial aid with one phone call. One. You think I'm afraid of a maid with a hairbrush? You're furniture. You've always been furniture. And furniture gets replaced." The kitchen clock ticked 3 times before Rosa spoke. She did not raise her voice. She did not step back. She did not cry. She looked at Adrian with the steady, unshakable calm of a woman who had buried her mother at 19 and raised 2 children who were not hers and survived every single thing the world had thrown at her by standing exactly where she was standing now. Still, quiet, unmoved. "You can take my job, Senora. You can take my papers. But you cannot take that little girl's memory of who held her in the dark. That you will never replace." Adrian blinked. Her lips parted but nothing came out. For 3 full seconds, the most polished woman in the room had absolutely nothing to say. And in that silence, Rosa picked up the sponge, turned back to the sink and continued cleaning, as though the most powerful sentence spoken in that kitchen all year had cost her nothing at all. But someone had heard every word. Standing just beyond the garden door, with a handful of rosemary and tears running silently down her weathered face, Helen pressed her back against the wall and made a decision she had been too afraid to make for months. Helen found Margaret in the study that afternoon. The older woman was sitting in her late husband's chair, the one with the cracked leather armrest that no one had ever reupholstered because it still smelled faintly of his pipe tobacco. Margaret was reading, or pretending to read, holding a book she hadn't turned a page of in 20 minutes. "Mrs. Calloway," Helen said from the doorway. Her voice was the voice of a woman standing at the edge of a cliff she had been walking toward for a very long time. "I need to tell you something. Several things. And I should have told you months ago." Margaret closed the book. She did not ask Helen to sit. She did not offer tea. She simply looked at the cook with the expression of a woman who already knew the water was poisoned and had been waiting for someone to say it out loud. Helen told her everything. The morning she saw Adrian grab Lily's hand hard enough to leave a red mark on the wrist. The afternoon she overheard Adrian on the phone in the pantry whispering about the timeline and making sure Garrett doesn't find out before January. The evening she watched Adrian hand a manila envelope to a man in a dark coat in the driveway. A man Helen recognized because he had been at every Calloway family gathering for 15 years. Douglas Pratt. Margaret's expression did not change, but her hand moved to the armrest and gripped the cracked leather so tightly that her knuckles turned the same color as the winter sky outside the window. "How many times?" Margaret asked. "The envelopes? 3 that I saw. Maybe more." Margaret stood up, crossed the room to the mahogany desk in the corner, and opened the bottom drawer, the one Garrett never touched because it had been his father's private space. Inside was a set of keys, an old address book, and a name Margaret had written on a scrap of paper 6 weeks ago, when something in her gut told her to start paying attention. The name was Warren Kehoe, the Calloway family's retired attorney, the man who had drawn up every legal document for the family since 1987. She called him that evening. By the next morning, Warren was sitting at Margaret's kitchen table with his reading glasses on the tip of his nose and a stack of documents that Douglas Pratt had filed quietly with Callaway Maritime's legal department 4 months earlier. It was a prenuptial agreement, but not the kind designed to protect Garrett. This one had been structured so that if Garrett were ever deemed emotionally unfit by 2 independent physicians, a clause Adrian had insisted on adding, citing her concern for his grief, controlling interest in Callaway Maritime Holdings would transfer to a joint conservatorship. The first named conservator was Adrian Whitfield. The second was Douglas Pratt. Warren set the document down and removed his glasses. "Margaret," he said quietly, "your son's best friend and his fiancée are trying to take his company, and if this goes through before anyone challenges it, they'll have the legal standing to do it." Margaret looked at the document. She looked at the name Douglas Pratt printed in clean black ink at the bottom of the page. The same Douglas who had carried Garrett on his shoulders at his 8th birthday party. The same Douglas who had given the toast at Elena's funeral. The same Douglas who had been sitting at that Thanksgiving table 2 nights ago, watching a 5-year-old girl scream the truth, and had said absolutely nothing. "Call my son," Margaret said, "and then call Rosa Delgado, because that woman has been watching this house more carefully than any of us, and I suspect she has seen things even Helen doesn't know about." Rosa came to the study that evening because Margaret asked her to. Not through Helen. Not through Garrett. Margaret walked down to the basement herself, knocked on Rosa's door, 2 soft knocks, the same way Rosa knocked on Lily's and said, "Would you come sit with me upstairs? I have something that belongs to you." Rosa followed her to the 2nd-floor sitting room, the one Margaret used when she didn't want to be disturbed. It was a small room with green wallpaper and a window that looked out onto the bare branches of an elm tree that had been standing in that yard longer than anyone in the family had been alive. Margaret sat in the wingback chair near the lamp. Rosa sat across from her on the ottoman, her hands folded in her lap the way she always kept them. Still, patient, waiting. Margaret studied her for a long moment. "What was your mother's name?" "Carmen. Carmen Delgado." Margaret nodded slowly, as though the name had confirmed something she had been carrying in her chest for weeks. She reached into the pocket of her cardigan and pulled out a small velvet pouch. She opened it and let the contents fall into her palm. A tiny silver pendant, oval-shaped, no bigger than a thumbnail, with a faint engraving of the Virgin Mary on one side and the initial CD scratched into the back with something sharp, maybe a pin, maybe a needle. Rosa stopped breathing. 31 years ago, Margaret began, her voice stripped of its usual New England composure. "I was 7 months pregnant with Garrett. I had a hemorrhage in the middle of the night. Richard, my husband, was in London on business. The staff had gone home. I was alone in this house, bleeding on the bathroom floor, and I was certain I was going to die there." She paused. The elm tree outside the window creaked in the wind. A young woman from the cleaning crew had forgotten her coat in the downstairs closet. She came back for it at 11 o'clock at night. She heard me through the floor. She broke the bathroom lock with a fire extinguisher. She wrapped me in towels. She carried me, Rosa, to her car and drove me to Massachusetts General. She stayed in the waiting room until 4 in the morning. When the doctors told her the baby would survive, she cried harder than I did. Margaret turned the pendant over in her fingers. She left before I was discharged. She left this pendant on the chair where she had been sitting. I asked the agency for her name. They told me Carmen Delgado. I tried to find her. For years I tried, but she had moved. The agency closed. The trail went cold. And I kept this pendant in my jewelry box for 3 decades, waiting for the day I could return it to the woman who saved my son's life before he was even born. Rosa's hand went to the thin silver chain around her neck, the chain that had been empty since the day she was 19, since the day she thought she had lost every last piece of her mother. Her fingers trembled against the bare spot where the pendant had once hung. Margaret leaned forward and placed it in Rose's palm. She closed Rose's fingers around it gently, the way you close a child's hand around something precious. Your mother saved Garrett, and now you're saving his daughter. This was never an accident, Rosa. You were always supposed to be in this house. Rosa pressed the pendant against her chest. She did not speak. She did not need to. The tears that fell from her eyes onto the silver oval said every word that 31 years of silence had been holding back. For Carmen. For the coat she forgot. For the bathroom lock she broke. For the son she saved who grew into a man whose child now called her daughter Mommy. The elm tree outside swayed once, long and slow, as though something very old had finally exhaled. The Callaway Maritime Winter Gala was held the second Saturday of December at the Harbor Hotel on Rose Wharf. 300 guests. Crystal chandeliers reflecting off the Boston harbor through floor-to-ceiling windows. Waiters in black vests carrying champagne on silver trays. The kind of evening where everyone smiled and no one said what they actually meant. Adrian arrived in a floor-length emerald gown. She held Garrett's arm and waved to board members as though Thanksgiving had never happened, as though the nanny cam footage had been deleted, as though she had already rewritten the story in her own favor. Douglas stood near the bar in a charcoal suit, checking his phone every 45 seconds. His jaw tight behind a smile he kept adjusting like a crooked tie. Garrett walked to the stage at 9:15. The room quieted. People expected the usual speech, quarterly numbers, charitable donations, a toast to the company's legacy. Instead, Garrett set his phone on the podium, connected it to the overhead screen, and said 5 words. I want to show you something. The first clip was the nanny cam footage from Tuesday. Adrian dragging Lily, the lock clicking, the 5-year-old crying on the floor. 300 people watched in absolute silence. A woman in the third row covered her mouth. A board member set down his champagne glass and did not pick it up again. The second clip was a recording Warren Kehoe had obtained from Callaway Maritime's internal servers. A phone call between Douglas and Adrian dated 3 weeks before the prenup was filed. Douglas's voice was unmistakable. Once we get the emotional unfitness ruling, the conservatorship triggers automatically. You handle Garrett. I handle the board. By March, it's ours. Douglas stood up from his barstool. Every eye in the room turned to him. He opened his mouth, but Warren Kehoe was already walking toward him with 2 men in dark suits who did not need to introduce themselves. Adrian did not move. Her emerald gown suddenly looked like a costume from a play that had just been canceled. And then Rosa spoke. She was standing near the back of the room. She had not been invited. Margaret had brought her. She wore a simple black dress Helen had lent her and the silver chain around her neck. Complete now, the pendant resting against her collarbone for the first time in 15 years. I'm not a businesswoman, she said. The room turned. I'm not a lawyer. I'm not on any board. I clean houses. I wash dishes. I fold clothes that don't belong to me. I have stood in rooms like this one 100 times, but always near the walls, always with a tray, always invisible. She paused. The harbor lights shimmered behind her through the glass. But invisible people see things. We see who is kind when no one important is watching. We see who locks a child in a room because a dress got stained. We see who whispers into phones when they think the help isn't listening. We see everything, because you never think to close the door when it's only the maid on the other side. Her voice had not risen once. Not a single syllable louder than the one before it. But every person in that ballroom felt the weight of those words press against their chest like a hand. That little girl didn't call me Mommy because I asked her to. She called me Mommy because I showed up. Every night. Every nightmare. Every time she cried and no one came. I came. Not because it was my job. Because she is a child. And children don't care about last names or bank accounts or emerald gowns. Children only care about who holds them in the dark. The silence that followed lasted 7 seconds. Then Margaret Callaway, seated in the front row with her hands folded over her cane, began to clap. One person joined, then another, then the entire room, 300 people standing, applauding a woman in a borrowed dress who had never raised her voice and never needed to. Douglas Pratt was escorted from the gala by federal investigators that same night. The conservatorship filing was voided by Monday morning. Warren Kehoe presented the full evidence package to the Suffolk County District Attorney's Office before the week was out. Wire fraud, conspiracy to defraud, and coercion. Adrian Whitfield was arrested at Logan Airport on Wednesday afternoon with a one-way ticket to Miami and 2 suitcases full of clothes she had bought with a credit card linked to Garrett's personal account. The emerald gown was found folded neatly on the guest bedroom bed. She had not left a note. The mansion on Beacon Hill went quiet again. But it was a different kind of quiet now. Not the hollow silence of a house holding its breath, but the soft, settled stillness of a home that had finally stopped pretending. Garrett moved Rosa out of the basement on the first day of January. Not into the master bedroom. Not into a guest suite. Into the room next to Lily's. The room that had been Elena's reading room, with tall windows and a radiator that clicked warmly every morning at 6. Rosa protested. Garrett told her it wasn't a promotion. It was a correction. Margaret stayed in the guest suite down the hall. She and Rosa began drinking tea together in the afternoons, sitting in the green wallpapered room with the elm tree outside the window. They didn't always talk. Sometimes Margaret would read and Rosa would mend a hem, and the only sound between them was the ticking of the old clock and the creak of branches that had been holding the same sky for longer than either of them had been alive. It was enough. Some bonds don't need conversation. They only need presence. Helen was given a raise and a title she never asked for, head of household, which she accepted with a short nod and a long cry in the pantry when no one was looking. Mateo finished his paramedic certification in the spring. He got a placement at Massachusetts General, the same hospital where Carmen Delgado had carried a bleeding woman 31 years earlier. He never knew that detail. Rosa never told him. Some circles closed silently. On a Sunday evening in early February, Garrett climbed the stairs to Lily's room. The girl was already in bed, the rabbit tucked under one arm, her eyes half closed. On the nightstand sat a glass of water, a picture book, and a space. A small, empty space where something was supposed to be. Garrett reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the wooden hairbrush. He set it on the nightstand carefully, the way you place something sacred on an altar. Lily opened one eye, looked at the brush, looked at her father and smiled. A smile so complete and so unguarded that it filled every room in that house at once. "Will you brush my hair, Daddy?" He sat on the edge of the bed. He picked up the brush that had belonged to Carmen Delgado, that had passed through Rosa's hands every night for a year and a half, that had carried the warmth of a woman who saved lives without ever being seen. And he pulled it gently through his daughter's hair. Once, twice, slowly, learning for the first time a rhythm that Rosa had known all along. Down the hallway, Rosa stood in her doorway listening. She touched the pendant on her chain. She closed her eyes. And for the first time since she was 19 years old, she did not feel invisible. The fork that had fallen on Thanksgiving night had long since been picked up. The cranberry sauce had been thrown away. The guests had gone home. But the sound that 5-year-old girl made when she screamed the truth across a dinner table, that sound was still echoing, not as noise, but as change. In the walls, in the family, in the quiet, unshakable woman who had held a hairbrush and hummed a melody with no name and no words until a silent child finally spoke. If the story reminded you that the people who show up in the dark are the ones who matter most, share it with someone who needs to hear that today.